1,500 yards quattrosec. One impossible challenge in artillery spotter, perfect timing. In the chaos of World War II, precision was a myth and timing was a gamble. Most shells missed their mark by miles, not inches. The odds were impossible. A 1 in 10,000 chance to hit a moving target behind cover. Military analysts said it couldn't be done with the technology of the era. On December 16, 1944, everything changed as the Ardennes forest turned into a frozen hell. A critical situation required a miracle, or a master of geometry. Every expert predicted failure for the small observation post on Hill 402. The German breakthrough was imminent, and the heavy guns were miles away. What happened in the next 10 minutes would completely rewrite World War II artillery tactics. Because one spotter didn't just survive, he achieved the perfect fire mission. The method used, it's a mystery element known as time on target sync. It required math that should have been impossible under direct fire. By the end, 40 shells would land within the same 1-second window. The tactic is still taught at West Point and Sandhurst today. The moment the spotter figured it out, minute 6 of the assaulters. Absolutely brilliant. Notice what happens when the physics of flight meets human intuition. Our story begins in the pre-dawn darkness, when Lieutenant John Masterson took his post. He was an unlikely hero with a background in civil engineering and mathematics. Masterson wasn't a career soldier, but he understood one thing: trajectories. He knew that a shell's flight time was the only constant in a world of variables. The strategic situation was dire. The American line was stretched to the breaking point. Masterson's post was the only thing standing between the panzers and the fuel depots. Communication was failing, and the atmospheric pressure was shifting the shell paths. Conventional wisdom said to wait for the fog to clear before firing. But the Germans weren't waiting. They were 2,000 yards out and accelerating. They called his timing impossible. But on this day, the laws of physics were his only weapon. He had to calculate lead times for 6 different batteries simultaneously while under fire. The cold air was denser, meaning the shells would fall short by 50 yards. Masterson realizes the standard tables are wrong. This is where the technical disadvantage becomes a death sentence for his unit. If he calls it in now, he hits his own men. If he waits, the tanks overrun them. The infantry in the foxholes below him are screaming for support, but Masterson remains silent, staring at his stopwatch and the horizon. He's waiting for the golden window of artillery spotter. Perfect timing. A single moment where the enemy speed matches his calculated flight time. Fire mission, he screams over the roar of incoming mortars. He isn't calling for one battery, he's calling for the entire divisional artillery. This is the first engagement of the time-on-target innovation. Each battery is located at a different distance from the target. To make them land at the same time, they must fire at different times. Masterson is conducting an orchestra of steel from a ridge of ice. The first shell is in the air for 34 seconds, the last for only 12. If his timing is off by even a fraction, the wall of fire will fail. The Germans see the first flash and prepare to dive for cover. Usually, they have seconds to scramble before the rest of the shells arrive. But there is no warning this time. No bracketing shots to give it away. The first thing they hear is the sound of 40 shells detonating at once. It's a tactical innovation that turns a field into a vacuum of fire. The precision of the artillery spotter perfect timing has turned the tide. 2 tanks are vaporized instantly. 3 more are tracked and burning. Masterson doesn't celebrate. He's already calculating the next coordinates. But here's what nobody knew at the time. The radio was dying. He had one last chance to coordinate the second wave before total silence. He stands up in his foxhole to see over the smoke. Bullets whiz past his head as he reaches for a signal flare. They called his timing impossible, and now he'd have to do it without a voice. He uses a signal, flare desperate, low-tech solution to a high-tech problem. The batteries behind him are waiting for the color code to launch. The batteries must see his signal through the thick Ardennes mist. Green means repeat range, and red means ceasefire in this emergency code. He prays. The battery commanders are watching the sky at this exact second. A response is immediate, a testament to the training of the U.S. artillery. The second wave of shells is launched into the blind white sky. This is the turning point for the survival of his battalion. The shells are following the exact path Masterson calculated on his scratched map. The achievement count begins to climb as the smoke finally clears. The enemy adaptation attempts fail because there is nowhere to hide. The psychological toll on the enemy is higher than the physical one. The Germans believe the Americans have a new, automated targeting computer. In reality, it was just one man, a stopwatch, and gravity. Masterson's physical toll is mounting as the temperature drops to sub-zero levels. Verification by witnesses in the infantry units confirmed the miracle strike. The shells fell like a single hammer blow. A sergeant reported later, "The German 6th Panzer Army's spearhead has been blunted on this single hill." The artillery spotter perfect timing had saved the entire sector from collapse. Masterson collapses back into his hole, exhausted but alive. Official recognition of time on target began shortly after this engagement. It was a radical shift from traditional bombardment methods used earlier. Masterson had proven that synchronized impact was the ultimate tactical advantage. News of the successful strike reached the high command within 48 hours. Generals were baffled by the accuracy achieved under such poor visibility. They began to implement Masterson's calculations into the standard field manuals. The surviving German officers recounted the horror of the silent barrage. They had no time to implement defensive maneuvers or seek overhead cover. It was the birth of modern, integrated fire support in the field. They called his timing impossible, but the math was about to speak for itself. Masterson remained on the front lines for another 3 months of combat. He continued to refine the timing for every battery under his control. Each new engagement provided more data for the perfecting of the tactic. He recorded the impact of humidity and wind speed on the shell drift. These notes would later become the foundation for a post-war artillery doctrine. By February 1945, the entire division was using synchronized fire missions. The impossible timing had become a standard operating procedure for the unit. Masterson was promoted, but he preferred staying in the observation posts. He felt a deep responsibility for the infantrymen huddled in the frozen mud. Every successful strike meant dozens of American lives were spared that day. His focus on artillery spotter, perfect timing, never wavered during the push. The precision allowed artillery to be used much closer to friendly lines. This danger-close support was previously considered too risky for general use. Masterson's timing reduced the margin of error to nearly zero. Even the veteran gunners were amazed at how the shells grouped together. It looked like a single massive explosion rather than 40 individual hits. The synchronization was so tight, it bypassed the enemy's reactive capabilities. As the war moved into Germany, the terrain became even more challenging. Masterson had to adjust for urban environments and concrete fortifications. Yet, the core principle of his timing remained the decisive factor. He often worked 20 hours a day, calculating fire tables by candlelight. His engineering background allowed him to visualize the arc of the shell. He could see the path of the steel before it ever left the barrel. The legend of the timekeeper began to spread through the Allied ranks. Soldiers felt safer knowing Masterson was watching the horizon for them. His timing was their shield against the desperate German counteroffensives. In one instance, he stopped a night raid using only 2 shells. He timed the impact to hit a bridge exactly as the lead vehicle crossed. The bridge collapsed, trapping the entire enemy column on the other side. They called his timing impossible, but the history books now call it a masterpiece. Masterson's legacy was being written in the smoke of every successful mission. He had turned a chaotic weapon into a surgical instrument of war. After the crossing of the Rhine, the end of the war was finally in sight. Masterson reflected on the thousands of shells he had directed over the months. He wondered if his perfect timing would be remembered after the peace. He received the Silver Star in a quiet ceremony behind the front lines. The citation mentioned his extraordinary heroism and mathematical precision under fire. He simply shook the general's hand and went back to his maps. The war in Europe ended, but Masterson's work with the artillery was not over. He was asked to stay and help document the tactics for the War Department. They needed to know exactly how he achieved the perfect timing. He spent months in an office in occupied Germany, drawing detailed diagrams. He explained the relationship between air density, propellant temperature, and flight time. The officers listening were stunned by the complexity of his mental math. His reports were sent back to the United States for immediate study. The Masterson method became the unofficial name for the synchronization process. It was the bridge between manual calculation and the digital age. When he finally returned home, he went back to his engineering career. He rarely spoke of the war or the impossible shots he had called. To him, it was just a problem that needed a precise solution. Years later, he was invited to speak at a military tactical symposium. He saw young officers using computers to do what he did with a stopwatch. He smiled, knowing he had paved the way for their technology. The transition from manual to automated artillery was based on his findings. His artillery spotter perfect timing was the precursor to modern GPS guided strikes. The fundamental physics remained exactly as he had mapped them in 1944. Historical archives now hold his original logs and scratched-out coordinate maps. Researchers still marvel at the accuracy he maintained during the Battle of the Bulge. It remains one of the greatest feats of field mathematics in history. They called his timing impossible, and yet he proved them wrong every single day. The impossible became the standard because he refused to accept failure. His story is a testament to the power of human intellect in combat. Let's look closer at the specific mechanics of that December strike. The shells were traveling at over 1,500 feet per second through the air. Any slight gust of wind would have sent them into the trees. Masterson accounted for the Coriolis effect, even without a mechanical computer. He adjusted the azimuth based on the rotation of the Earth itself. This level of detail was unheard of for a field-grade observer. The batteries were spread across 3 different valleys for maximum concealment. This geographic spread made the timing coordination even more difficult to manage. Masterson had to account for the altitude difference of each gun. A gun at a higher elevation has a different flight path than a gun below. He normalized these variables into a single, unified time-on-target plan. It was a feat of multi-variable calculus performed under heavy mortar fire. The infantry below were watching the tanks grow larger in their sights. They had no idea that a man on a hill was saving their lives. They only knew that when the shells hit, they hit perfectly. It was like the sky opened up and swallowed the panzers. One survivor noted, the artillery spotter perfect timing had created a localized zone of destruction. The enemy's momentum was shattered in a single, synchronized heartbeat. Masterson's ability to remain calm was his greatest asset in the foxhole. While others panicked at the sound of the tanks, he focused on his watch. He knew that emotion was the enemy of accurate calculation. He represents the silent professionals who changed the course of the war, not through bravado, but through the application of science and logic. The impossible timing was simply a matter of getting the math right. The shells used were standard high-explosive rounds with mechanical time fuses. Masterson had to tell the loaders exactly what setting to put on each fuse. A mistake on a single fuse would have ruined the entire sequence. They called his timing impossible, but the results were scattered across the frozen road. The wreckage of the 6th Panzer Army was proof of his success. His name would be whispered in artillery circles for decades to come. Notice the way the shells impacted in a perfect box around the target. This wasn't a random bombardment. It was a shaped strike for maximum effect. Masterson was thinking 3 dimensions ahead of the enemy commanders. He used the terrain to funnel the tanks into his preset kill zones. By the time the Germans realized the trap, the shells were already descending. The timing was so perfect that retreat was no longer an option. This level of synchronization is what modern militaries call integrated fires. In 1944, it was just a crazy idea from a lieutenant with the slide rule. Masterson's bravery was in trusting his own numbers against the odds. As we move into the final act of this story, consider the legacy left behind. The tactics developed in the snow of the Ardennes are still relevant today. The artillery spotter perfect timing is the heart of every modern strike. Masterson passed away in 1998, a quiet man who lived a long, full life. He never sought fame for the impossible timing he had achieved in the war. He was content knowing he had done his duty with absolute precision. Today, we have satellites and drones to do the work Masterson did, but the drone operators still study the fundamentals he helped to establish. They learn that technology is only as good as the timing of the strike. The Masterson method lives on in the digital algorithms of modern howitzers. Every time a time-on-target mission is fired, his spirit is there. He is the ghost in the machine of modern military ballistics. The hills of the Ardennes are quiet now, the craters filled with grass, but the trees still bear the scars of the steel Masterson sent down. The landscape itself remembers the day the timing was perfect. We must never forget the cost of the precision he worked so hard to achieve. Every shell represented a choice between total destruction and tactical success. Masterson chose the path of the Scala Soldier. To save his men, they called his timing impossible. But he proved that nothing is truly impossible. All it takes is the right person in the right place at the right time, and perhaps a very accurate stopwatch to measure the seconds. Let's review the key lesson from Masterson's artillery spotter: perfect timing. It teaches us that technical disadvantages can be overcome by superior application. It wasn't the gun that won the day. It was the timing. This story is more than just a military history lesson for the viewer. It is a study in how focus and expertise can change the world. Masterson changed the world from a hole in the ground in Belgium. The next time you face a challenge that seems mathematically impossible, think of him. Think of the man who stood in the freezing wind and did the math. The man who refused to believe the experts who said it couldn't be done. His timing was a beacon of hope in the darkest days of the winter of '44. It was the moment the tide finally turned for the Allied forces. The impossible challenge was met with an even more impossible solution. Masterson's story is a reminder that excellence is often found in the details. The 4 seconds that separated the shells were the 4 seconds that won. Those seconds were bought with the sweat and blood of a spotter. The final confirmation of his impact came from the German archives after the war. Enemy reports described the American artillery as terrifyingly efficient and inhuman. They couldn't understand how a human could coordinate such a strike. But Masterson was very much human, with cold hands and a racing heart. He just knew that his men were counting on his artillery spotter, perfect timing. He wouldn't let them down, not as long as his watch was ticking. The legacy of Hill 402 remains a cornerstone of tactical military history. It is a story of how one man's mind was the most powerful weapon on the field. The steel was just the medium for his mathematical genius. As the sun sets on our story, we see the impact of his work everywhere. In the manuals, in the museums, and in the memories of the survivors. Masterson's perfect timing was the miracle of the Ardennes forest. They called his timing impossible, yet today it is the gold standard of global warfare. The principles of physics and the human will to survive are a potent mix. Masterson was the catalyst that brought them together that day. Here's why this matters today. The principles of physics don't change over time. Masterson proved that human intuition is the ultimate force multiplier in any conflict. Technology changes, but the need for perfect timing remains constant. He was awarded the Silver Star for his actions that day in the Ardennes, but his true legacy is the lives of the men who didn't die on Hill 402. Those men went home to their families because of his stopwatch and his courage. The next time you see a precision strike, remember the man with the stopwatch. True perfect timing isn't about the machine. It's about the mind behind it. It's about the person who dares to calculate the impossible. If you want more stories of tactical innovation against impossible odds, hit subscribe now. Every week, we dive into the moments where history was decided by a split second. We honor the innovators who changed the world through their skill. Next week, how a group of artists fooled the Wehrmacht with inflatable tanks and sound. The Ghost Army's decoy tactic is another example of brilliance under fire. See you then for more stories of the impossible made real.